The dining room at Robert's house seats 12 comfortably, and 16 when someone pulls the extra chairs from the garage. That evening, there were 10 of us, Robert and Linda Chen, my wife's sister, and her husband, 2 of Marcus's colleagues from the real estate office, a neighbor couple whose name I still don't remember, Sarah, Marcus, and me. The table smelled like garlic bread, and the good candles Linda only brings out when she's trying to impress someone. Marcus was trying to impress someone. He had been talking for 40 minutes. I was standing near the sideboard, holding a glass of Merlot I hadn't touched. Old habit. When I was doing forensic audits, I learned early that the person holding a drink and not drinking it sees everything the people drinking are too comfortable to notice. Marcus was comfortable. He was in the middle of a story about a commercial property deal. He'd almost closed the word almost, doing a lot of work in that sentence when he turned to the table and said it. The thing is, in this family, I'm the one who understands money. Sarah's brilliant at what she does. Don't get me wrong. He paused there, the way people pause when they want credit for being generous before they aren't. But financially, she'll never make it on her own. She'll always be dependent on someone else. That's just how she's wired. He said it like it was fact, not an opinion, not a worry, not even a concern. A fact. The kind of thing you say when you've already decided the argument is over and you're just explaining the outcome to people who weren't there for it. I looked at Sarah. She was sitting 3 chairs down from me, next to Linda, holding her own wine glass with both hands. She looked at Marcus for exactly 2 seconds. Then she smiled, not the smile she gives when something is funny, but the smaller one, the one I've seen since she was 9 years old, and a teacher said something dismissive in front of the class. She said, "Okay, Marcus," and turned back to Linda to ask about the garlic bread recipe. That was all. The table moved on. Marcus's colleague laughed at something. Robert refilled glasses. The conversation shifted to the Seahawks and whether the offensive line would hold this season. I stayed at the sideboard. I watched Sarah talk to Linda about bread. And I thought about the email I had read 3 weeks earlier, the one she had forwarded to me with no subject line and no message, just the attachment, the offer letter, the new title, the new compensation package. Director of Project Management, Pacific Northwest Division, base salary plus performance equity, total annual compensation $760,000. She had sent it to me at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I'd called her immediately. She picked up on the second ring and said, "Don't tell anyone yet. Dad, I just wanted you to know." I asked her why she hadn't told Marcus. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He doesn't ask." Marcus had no idea what she actually earned. Not even close. He was standing at that table, explaining to 8 people that his wife would always be financially dependent, while she was pulling in more than 3 times his annual commissions on a bad quarter. He said it with the confidence of a man who had never thought to check. I set my wine glass on the sideboard. I looked at the ceiling, the same habit I had in conference rooms when I needed to think without anyone reading my face. Robert's dining room ceiling has a plaster medallion in the center, painted cream. I focused on that. There are moments in a long life when you understand that what you do in the next 30 seconds will determine what happens in the next 30 months. I had been in enough boardrooms and enough depositions to know that impulse and preparation are not the same thing. Marcus was not going to be corrected at a dinner table, not by me, not tonight. Anything I said in that room would embarrass Sarah before it embarrassed him, and Sarah had already made her choice. She had smiled and turned away. I was going to respect that choice, but I was not going to let it be the last word. I left the dining room before dessert and sat in Robert's study for 11 minutes. Then I drove home. I called Patricia Whitmore at 9:43 that evening. Patricia has been the family's attorney for 20 years. She handled my wife's estate. She reviewed Sarah's first employment contract when she was 26, and she is the kind of person who answers the phone on a Sunday night without sighing. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her what Marcus had said. I told her about the offer letter. I told her that my son-in-law had stood in front of 8 people and declared his wife financially incompetent while having no working knowledge of what she actually earned, what she owned, or what she was capable of. Patricia listened without interrupting. That's one of the things I've always valued about her. When I finished, she said, "What do you want to do?" I thought about Sarah's face at the table, the 2-second look, the small smile, the pivot to garlic bread. "I want him to know the truth," I said, "but I want it to happen correctly, in front of people who matter, at a moment when he can't walk it back." Patricia was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "That's not a phone call, David. That's a plan." "I know," I said. "How long are you willing to wait?" I looked out of the kitchen window. The street was empty. The neighbor's porch light was on, the way it always is. "As long as it takes," I said, "but not longer than necessary." Patricia said she'd start pulling together what we'd need. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a while, not doing anything in particular, thinking about a 34-year-old woman who had just been told she would never make it by a man who had never once thought to ask what she was already making. I didn't sleep well that night, but I wasn't angry. Anger is expensive, and I've learned to spend it carefully. What I felt, sitting at that table in the dark, was something quieter and more useful than anger. I felt certain. I met Marcus Morrison for the first time at a dinner Sarah hosted in her apartment on Capitol Hill about 10 years ago. She had cooked salmon. She always overcooks salmon, just like her mother did, and Marcus arrived 20 minutes late with a bottle of wine he'd clearly bought at the gas station 2 blocks away. I know the store. I've lived in Seattle long enough to recognize their labels. He set it on the counter like he was presenting something significant. And Sarah smiled and thanked him, and I watched him look around her apartment the way a man looks at a property he's considering making an offer on. That was my first impression. I noted it and said nothing. Sarah had been working at Meridian Technologies for 3 years by then. She was a project engineer, managing infrastructure rollouts for enterprise clients, and she was good at it in the way that quiet people are good at things steadily, without announcement, accumulating results that other people eventually had to acknowledge. Her salary at that point was somewhere around $120,000 a year. For a 34-year-old in Seattle's tech sector, that was not exceptional. It was solid. It was the beginning of something, if she kept at it. Marcus was selling commercial real estate for a firm in Bellevue. He talked about it the way salesmen talk about their work in peaks and possibilities, in deals that almost closed, in clients who were this close to signing. He told me over dinner that first night, anywhere from $80,000 to $120,000 depending on the year. I asked him what a good year looked like. He said 120. I asked what a bad year looked like. He said he didn't have bad years. I nodded and helped myself to more salmon. They married 18 months later. I stood in the second row at the ceremony, next to my brother Frank, and I watched my daughter walk toward a man I had decided to observe rather than judge. That was my commitment to myself. Observe. Don't judge. Sarah was 35. She was not asking for my opinion. She was asking me to be there, and I was there. The first 4 years of their marriage, from the outside, looked like most marriages look from the outside. They bought a house in Ballard. Marcus's commute to Bellevue was manageable. Sarah's office was downtown, 12 minutes on the light rail. They had a dog, a Labrador mix named Chester, who shed everywhere and seemed genuinely happy in a way that I found reassuring about the household. What I didn't know, in those first 4 years, was what was happening to Sarah's salary. She told me eventually. Not all at once. Sarah has never done anything all at once. She told me in pieces, over different conversations, the way you tell someone something you're still figuring out how to say. The first piece came during a Sunday phone call in the second year of their marriage when she mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd received a raise. I asked how much. She said she'd moved from $120,000 to $150,000. I said that was excellent. She said yes. Then she said, "I didn't tell Marcus." I was quiet for a moment. Why not? Because the last time I mentioned a raise when I got the bump to $130,000, he said I was getting too ambitious. that I was going to turn into one of those women who cares more about her career than her marriage. She paused. I was tired of the conversation, so I just didn't have it. I didn't say anything right away. I've learned that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say. And Sarah said one more thing. I keep a separate account. My direct deposit goes there. He doesn't know about it. I said, does he have access to joint accounts? She said yes. She contributed to the joint account for the mortgage, utilities, groceries. Marcus contributed roughly the same. The household ran on that. Her separate account was hers, and it was invisible to him, and she intended to keep it that way. I told her I understood. I didn't tell her what I thought, because she hadn't asked what I thought. She was 36 years old, and she had made a decision about her own marriage, and it was not my place to reopen it. I filed it away instead, the way I file most things carefully, in a place I can find it later. Over the next 2 years, she called me twice more about salary. Once when she moved to $200,000 and once when she crossed $280,000. Both times, the conversation followed the same pattern she told me. I asked about Marcus. She said he didn't know. I didn't push. By the fourth call, I understood the architecture of what she had built. Separate account. A PO soundbox on Eastlake Avenue for any financial correspondence she didn't want coming to the house. Tax filings that she handled independently with a CPA she'd found on her own. Marcus signed a joint return each year. They filed jointly for the mortgage deduction, but the numbers Sarah's CPA prepared were structured in ways that a man who didn't look closely wouldn't question. Marcus didn't look closely. He never looked closely at anything that didn't have his name at the top. I am a financial advisor. I have been one for 22 years. Before that, I was an auditor for 11 years, and before that, I spent 3 years in a small accounting firm in Tacoma learning how money moves and where it hides when people want it to. I say this not to establish credentials, but to explain why I noticed. What I noticed the architecture of Sarah's finances was not the work of someone hiding something shameful. It was the work of someone protecting something real. There is a difference. I've seen both, and I know which one looks like which. What I also noticed in those middle years was Marcus. He had a habit, at family gatherings, of speaking about money in ways that positioned him as the authority. Not aggressively, he was never aggressive in public, which is its own kind of skill. He was pleasant about it. He would say things like, Sarah's great at what she does, but I'm the one who keeps us on track financially. And people would nod, because that's what people do when a man says something confident at a dinner table. I watched it happen at Thanksgiving one year, when Marcus told my brother Frank that he'd been managing the household portfolio and that Sarah left the money stuff to him. Frank looked at me across the table. I looked at my plate. The clearest version of it came at a dinner party Sarah and Marcus hosted in their 5th year of marriage. I was there because Sarah had invited me, and because I had learned that being present at these gatherings was more useful than staying home. There were 8 people at the table, colleagues of Marcus's from the Bellevue office, a couple Sarah knew from her running group, and me. Marcus was in the middle of a story about a commercial property deal he'd nearly closed. And somehow the story turned, the way Marcus's stories often turned, toward a broader point about financial management and the importance of having someone in the marriage who understood how money worked. He said, and I remember this precisely because I wrote it down in a notebook when I got home, Sarah earns, but I decide that's just how it works for us. She's not really built for the money side of things. I keep us organized. The woman across the table, one of Sarah's friends from her running group, a woman named Diane, glanced at Sarah. Sarah smiled and reached for her wine glass. It was the smile I recognized from her childhood, the one she used when she had already decided not to fight about something. I looked at Marcus. He was still talking. I drove home that night, thinking about what it means to decide who someone is before you've asked who they are. Marcus had decided Sarah was not built for money. He had decided this without asking. He had decided it so completely that he said it out loud at a dinner table in front of 8 people, including her father, and he didn't notice anything wrong with the sentence. That was the part I kept returning to on the drive home, on the 520 bridge with the lights of the lake below, not the condescension, which I had expected, but the certainty. He was certain he had no data, no evidence, no conversation to support the certainty, but he had it anyway, fully formed, and he wore it like a fact. Sarah called me 3 weeks later. She said she'd been promoted again. I asked to what? She said Director of Project Management, Enterprise Division, and her total compensation package base salary, performance bonus, and equity came to $520,000 for the year. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Sarah, does Marcus know?" She said, "No." I said, "How long do you plan to keep this up?" She said, "Bo, I don't want it to become a fight. Every time I've tried to talk about my career, it turns into a conversation about how I'm too focused or too driven, or how I'm making him feel like he's not enough. I'm tired of managing his feelings about my success. I just want to do my job." I said, "I understand that." She said, "I know you do." I didn't tell her what I was beginning to think. I didn't tell her that the longer this went on, the more dangerous it became, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because a man who has decided who you are doesn't change that decision quietly. When Marcus eventually discovered the truth, and I had no doubt that eventually he would not feel grateful or impressed. He would feel deceived. And a man who feels deceived looks for something to take. I started making notes after that call. Nothing elaborate, a legal pad in the filing cabinet in my home office, behind the hanging folders for my own clients. I wrote down dates, amounts, the names of accounts Sarah had mentioned. I wrote down the name of her CPA, which she'd told me once in passing. I wrote down Patricia Whitmore's number because Patricia had handled my wife's estate, and I knew she was the kind of attorney who understood that preparation is not the same as paranoia. I didn't call Patricia yet. It wasn't time. Sarah hadn't asked for help, and I had learned over 34 years of being her father that offering help before it's wanted is just another form of deciding who someone is before you've asked. But I kept the notes, and I kept them current, and every time Sarah called me about a tax question or a contribution limit or whether she should increase her 401k allocation, I updated the pad in the filing cabinet, and I thought about a man on the 520 bridge who was certain about things he had never once thought to verify. He had never asked. In 8 years of marriage, through every salary increase, every promotion, every equity grant, every bonus cycle, he had never once asked Sarah what she made. He had told people. He had told them confidently, at dinner tables and in passing conversations, and probably in his own head at night. But he had never asked. She had chosen silence over conflict. He had chosen assumption over curiosity. And between those two choices, they had built something that looked, from the outside, like a marriage, and was, from the inside, a structure waiting for the right kind of pressure. I knew what kind of pressure was coming. I just didn't know yet when. Sarah called me on a Thursday afternoon in March, which I remember because I was reviewing a client's quarterly portfolio, and the cherry trees along the East Lake waterfront had just started to bloom. She said she needed to talk about something work-related, and could she come by the office? Not the house. The office. That told me something before she arrived. She came in at 4:30, set her bag on the chair across from my desk, and handed me a letter. It was on company letterhead, the kind that costs money to print. Heavy stock, embossed logo in the corner. I read it twice. Then I set it down and looked at her. The title change was effective the 1st of the month. Director of Project Management, Pacific Northwest Division. The compensation structure was itemized on the second page base salary of $480,000 with a projected annual bonus of $280,000 contingent on division performance metrics. Total anticipated compensation $760,000 per year. I had been a financial advisor for 31 years. I had helped clients manage inheritances, business exits, sudden wealth, long-term accumulation. I knew how to read a compensation letter without showing anything on my face. I read it a third time anyway. "Congratulations," I said. "I don't know what to do with it," she said. "Not the promotion, the money." That was the moment I understood the shape of what she was carrying. She had earned this every hour of it, every quarter of managed delivery, every team she had pulled through impossible timelines, and her first instinct was not pride. It was uncertainty about what to do with a number her husband had never imagined she could produce. I told her we had work to do. Over the following 3 weeks, we met 4 times at my office and twice over the phone. I walked her through a structure I had seen protect people in situations that hadn't yet become situations, the kind of financial architecture that looks like simple good sense until the day it turns out to be the only thing standing between a person and a very expensive mistake. The first account was a high-yield savings vehicle, opened in her name alone, at a bank she had not previously used. The second was a managed investment account with a brokerage I trusted, structured around a 15-year growth horizon with quarterly rebalancing. The third was a contribution increase to her existing 401k that brought her to the maximum allowable deferral. All correspondence statements, confirmations, tax documents went to a P.O. box she opened at a UPS store on Capitol Hill. Not the house on Mercer Island. Not any address Marcus had ever seen on an envelope. She asked me once if this was unusual. I told her it was standard practice for any professional earning at this level who wanted to maintain financial clarity. That was true. It was also incomplete. "Sarah," I said, on the second Tuesday of April, when the accounts were set up and the documents were signed, "you need to be able to stand on your own ground. Whatever happens in 10 years, in 20, in 2, you need to know that this is yours. Not because anything is wrong, because you are a person with a financial life, and a person with a financial life needs to protect it." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "He doesn't know what I make." I said, "I know." She didn't ask me how I knew. She already knew how I knew. I had been watching the way Marcus talked about money for 6 years, the casual pronouncements, the cheerful inaccuracies, the confident estimates he offered at family dinners without ever turning to ask her to confirm them. A man who knows his wife earns 5 times what he does not make those pronouncements. He had no idea, and because he had no idea, he had built a version of their financial life in his head that had very little to do with their financial life on paper. After she left, I opened a separate file on my desktop. I am methodical by training and by temperament. 31 years of client work will do that to a person. I listed every account, every institution, the approximate balance at time of opening, the projected growth rate, and the annual contribution schedule. Then I added a second column. Marcus's income, based on what I had pieced together from conversation and what Sarah had mentioned without emphasis over the years, approximately $140,000 annually, including base and commission on a good year. Variable, commission dependent, subject to market cycles in a way that a salaried position with equity participation is not. The ratio was 5.4 to 1. I sat with that number for a while. I had seen ratios like this before in my practice, not often, but enough. What I had learned was that the ratio itself is rarely the problem. The problem is what happens when one person knows the ratio and the other person has constructed an entirely different ratio in their imagination and has been living inside that construction for years. The collision between those two versions of reality is never quiet. I called Patricia Whitmore that evening. Patricia and I had known each other for 22 years. She had handled my wife's estate. She had reviewed my own documents twice. And she had the particular quality of a person who has seen enough family law to understand that the legal question and the human question are almost never the same question. I told her about the accounts. I told her about the compensation structure. I told her about the PUO box and the documentation. I did not tell her I was certain anything was going to happen. I told her I wanted to understand the landscape. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "David, if these accounts were established independently, funded exclusively by her separate income, and maintained without commingling of marital funds, they would almost certainly qualify as separate property under Washington state law. But you need a clear paper trail, dates of establishment, funding sources, no joint access, No transfers in or out that could be characterized as marital. I told her the paper trail was clean. She said, then prepare a summary document, something that can be produced quickly if the situation requires it. Account numbers, balances, establishment dates, funding history, keep it current. I told her I already had one started. There was a pause on her end. She said, how long have you been thinking about this? I said, long enough. I updated the summary document every quarter after that. Account balances, contribution amounts, projected values at 5, 10, and 15 years. A separate column for Marcus's publicly stated estimates of their financial situation, sourced from things he had said at family gatherings, numbers I had written down afterward in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer. Not because I expected to use them, but because I had learned over 31 years that the difference between a number someone believes and a number that exists on paper is the most important distance in any financial conversation. By the end of that first year, Sarah's separate accounts held just over $340,000. Marcus, as far as I could tell, believed their household ran on something in the range of $180,000 combined. He had said approximately that at Thanksgiving. In the context of a conversation about real estate investment, he had said it with confidence. No one at the table had corrected him. Sarah had looked at her plate. I had looked at Marcus. He had been completely certain. That was the part that stayed with me, not the inaccuracy, but the certainty. A man who has never been given a reason to question his assumptions will carry them like facts. He had never asked. She had never told him. And so he had remained, for 8 years, entirely confident about something he had never once thought to verify. The file on my desktop grew. The notebook in my desk drawer filled up. The cherry trees bloomed again the following March. And the March after that. I kept the summary current. I waited for the situation to require it. The promotion came through in February. Sarah called me the same evening, and I could hear something in her voice that I hadn't heard in a long time, a kind of quiet satisfaction, the sound of a person who has done something difficult and knows it. She told me the title first, Director of Program Operations. Then she told me the number. I wrote it down, though I already knew it from the documents she had sent me 3 months earlier when the offer was being structured. $760,000, base and equity combined, before the performance bonus. I told her I was proud of her. I meant it without qualification. She said Marcus had taken her to dinner to celebrate. He had ordered a good bottle of wine and made a toast about how proud he was of her little promotion. She said it with a small laugh, the kind that sits just above crying. I noted the phrase, little promotion. I wrote that down too. The change in Marcus came gradually, the way a shift in weather comes not all at once, but in a series of small signs that a person learns to read if they have been paying attention long enough. I had been paying attention for 6 years. By April, he had started asking questions that were not really questions. He would say things like, "Why are you working this late again?" and "Shouldn't your team be handling this by now?" and "I thought the point of a promotion was that you'd have more time, not less." He said these things in a reasonable tone, the kind that made them sound like concern. I know what concern sounds like. That was not it. Concern asks. What Marcus was doing was something different. He was establishing a position. He was deciding, without any evidence to support the decision, that Sarah's hours were excessive, that her priorities were wrong, that her choices required his approval. He started saying she should spend more time at home, not as a request, as a statement of how things ought to be. Sarah called me on a Thursday night in May. It was past 10 o'clock, which meant she had waited until Marcus was asleep, or out, before she picked up the phone. She didn't open with a greeting. She said, "Dad, I don't know what to do." I let her talk. She told me about the conference first. It was a 3-day event in San Francisco, the company's annual infrastructure summit, the kind that division directors are expected to attend and often expected to present at. Sarah had been on the agenda for 4 months. The travel was booked. Her presentation had been reviewed twice by James Hartley's team. Marcus had told her she wasn't going. Not asked. Told. He had said it on a Wednesday evening. She told me. When she mentioned she needed to pack the following morning, he had been standing in the kitchen, and he had turned around and said, very calmly, "I need you here this weekend. Cancel it." She had said the conference wasn't optional. He had said everything is optional if you decide it is. She had said her name was on the agenda. He had said they could find someone else. She had said she was presenting to 40 senior engineers and 3 board observers. He had said, "Sarah, I'm telling you, I need you here. What does that say about your priorities?" She had gone to the bedroom and closed the door and called me from there. She said, with the water running in the bathroom, so he wouldn't hear. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her what she had decided. She said she was going to San Francisco. She said she had already decided that before she called me. I told her I thought that was right. After we hung up, I opened the notepad on my desk, the legal pad I had been keeping since the dinner at Robert Chen's house, and I wrote down the date. And then I wrote down a single sentence. He told her to cancel a presentation to 40 engineers and 3 board observers because he needed her home. I underlined the last 4 words. I did not know yet exactly when I would use that sentence, but I knew I would. He had used the phrase ambitious woman the way some people use a diagnosis as if ambition were a symptom of something that needed correcting. He had told her that women who prioritize their careers over their families end up alone. She said, "I'm exhausted, Dad. I come home and I'm still working, and then I have to manage his feelings about the fact that I'm working, and I don't know how much longer I can do both." I asked her one question. "Sarah, does he know what you earn?" She was quiet for a moment. "No, I still haven't told him." I had expected this answer. I had been expecting it for 2 years. Sarah's silence about her finances was not carelessness. It was a decision she had made early in the marriage, a kind of protection she had built around herself without fully understanding what she was protecting against. She had watched Marcus spend freely and confidently in the first years, had watched him talk about money with the particular ease of someone who has never had to account for it carefully. And she had made a quiet calculation: the less he knew about what she earned, the less leverage he would have over how she spent it. She had been right about that, but she had not anticipated what ignorance would do to him, how it would allow him to construct an entire picture of their financial life in which he was the primary engine and she was a secondary contributor, a woman with a decent salary and a demanding schedule who needed to be reminded of her priorities. I told her to get some sleep. I told her we would talk more soon. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time without turning on a light. What Marcus was doing had a specific mechanism, and I had seen it before in the work I used to do, not in marriages, but in financial structures where one party controls the information and the other party draws conclusions from incomplete data. Marcus had never asked what Sarah earned. She had never told him. And so he had filled the gap with an assumption that flattered his own position that he was the one who understood money, that his income was the foundation, that her work was supplementary, and her hours were a choice she was making at the expense of the family. He was controlling her through contempt, and the contempt was built entirely on a number he had never once thought to verify. If he had known the truth, the contempt would not have been possible. But I had also learned over the years that people who build their sense of authority on false assumptions do not simply adjust when the assumptions are corrected. They feel deceived. They feel threatened. And a man who feels threatened does not become more reasonable. He becomes more aggressive. I was thinking about this when James Hartley called. James was the head of human resources at Sarah's company, a careful, measured man in his early 50s who had known our family for nearly a decade through a mutual connection at a nonprofit board we had both served on. He called on a Friday afternoon, and I could hear the particular hesitation in his voice that meant he was about to say something he was not entirely sure he should say. He told me he was worried about Sarah. He said she had been looking tired, that she had mentioned some stress at home in passing, and that he wanted to make sure she was all right. He said, "David, does she have support? Is she okay?" I told him she was managing. I did not tell him what she had told me, but I listened carefully to what James was not quite saying, that the people who worked with Sarah every day, who had watched her build a team, close contracts, present to board members, negotiate with vendors, those people knew exactly what she was worth. They saw her numbers. They saw her output. They had voted unanimously to give her the title and the compensation that reflected what she actually contributed. Only one person in her life did not know, and that person was the one telling her she was not doing enough. After I hung up with James, I called Sarah back. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been awake and waiting. I said, "I need you to listen to me." She said she was listening. I told her that I understood why she had kept her silence. I told her that the decision had made sense when she made it, and that I was not criticizing the choice. But I told her that what Marcus was doing, the pressure, the words he was using, the way he was framing her work as a failure of character rather than a professional commitment that was not going to stop. It was going to get worse, because he was operating from a position he had never had to defend, and positions like that do not soften on their own. I told her I was going to make sure the truth came out. I told her I would make sure it happened in a way that he could not walk back from, could not reframe, could not turn into another argument about her priorities or her ambition or the kind of wife she was supposed to be. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad, I'm scared." I told her I knew. I told her that was all right. Then I told her to let me handle the timing. I had been keeping the file current for 2 years. I had the documents, the account summaries, the compensation structure, the equity schedule. I had Patricia Whitmore on retainer, and Patricia had been practicing a family law in Seattle for 27 years and had never once been surprised by a number I put in front of her. I had James, who had called me without prompting because he was worried about a woman he respected. What I did not yet have was the right moment, a moment public enough that it could not be undone, a moment when Marcus would be at his most certain, his most confident, his most willing to say out loud what he had only been saying at home. I did not tell Sarah any of this. She did not need to know the details. She only needed to know that I had seen what was happening, that I understood it completely, and that I was not going to let it continue. I went to my desk. I opened the file. I updated the last entry with the date and a single note ready. Then I closed the laptop and made coffee and stood at the window for a while, watching the lights across the water. The sound was dark and flat and very still. I had stood at that window 100 times over the years, in different seasons, for different reasons. This time felt different. This time I was not waiting anymore. The company fundraiser was held on a Thursday evening in late October on the 42nd floor of a building in South Lake Union. I had been to the neighborhood a dozen times over the year's client meetings, a seminar at the Gates Foundation offices, once to pick Sarah up when her car was in the shop. But I had never been to this particular building, and when I stepped out of the elevator and saw the room floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of the city below, Elliott Bay dark and silver in the distance, I understood immediately why Sarah's company had chosen it. There were perhaps 50 people in the room. I recognized the type, a mix of the people who build things and the people who fund them, with a layer of staff in between, keeping everyone comfortable. Sarah had arranged my invitation 3 days earlier. She had not explained why she wanted me there. She had only said, "Come in, Dad. There's something I want you to see." I had not asked what. I had learned, over the years, that Sarah's silences were not accidents. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and found a position near the windows, slightly to the left of the main cluster of conversation. From there, I could see most of the room. It was a habit from my auditing years. You find the edge of the room, and you watch the center. Marcus was near the center. He was talking to a man I recognized from the company's website, Robert Chen, one of the lead investors in Sarah's division. Robert was in his mid-50s, silver at the temples, the kind of man who listened carefully before he spoke. Marcus was doing most of the talking. He had a glass of red wine in one hand and the posture of a man who believed he was exactly where he was supposed to be. I moved closer. Not directly. I stopped to look at a framed photograph on the wall, a black and white aerial of the city from sometime in the 1960s. I studied it for a moment. From that position, I could hear Marcus clearly. "I am the financial manager of this household," Marcus was saying. "Sarah earns the income, but I'm the one who decides how it's allocated. She's talented. Don't get me wrong, but she doesn't have the business instincts. She'll never be truly successful financially. That requires a different kind of thinking." He said it pleasantly. That was the part that stayed with me, how pleasant his voice was. He was not bragging exactly. He was explaining. The way a man explains something he has believed for so long that it no longer occurs to him that someone might disagree. Robert Chen looked at him for a moment without expression. Then he said, "Is that right? Sarah is our director of project management. She oversees a $50 million annual budget. Are you certain about that assessment?" There was a pause. Marcus's smile did not disappear, but it changed the way a photograph changes when you look at it too long and realize the perspective is slightly off. He said something about different kinds of success, about the difference between managing someone else's money and building your own. Robert nodded once politely and looked across the room. I set my water glass down on a nearby ledge and walked toward Marcus. He saw me coming. His expression shifted into something more comfortable. I was family. Familiar ground. "David," he said, "good to see you here." "Marcus," I said. I looked at Robert Chen and introduced myself. "David Chen, Sarah's father." Robert shook my hand. "She's spoken of you. You're in financial consulting." "Independent advisory," I said, "for about 20 years now." I turned back to Marcus. I said, "I couldn't help overhearing. You mentioned you're the financial manager of the household." He looked at me with the particular confidence of a man who has never been questioned by his father-in-law on this subject. "That's right," he said. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out the envelope. It was a standard business envelope, white, sealed. I had carried it there that evening. I handed it to Marcus and said, "There are some things in here you should probably see. I've been meaning to give them to you for a while." He took it. He looked at it for a moment, then opened it. I watched his face. The first document was Sarah's most recent pay statement, the full summary, not a partial. The number at the top was not hidden or obscured. $760,000. Annual compensation, inclusive of base salary, performance bonus, and equity distributions. He stared at it. He turned to the second document, a single page from Patricia Whitmore's office, listing the accounts Sarah had maintained separately over the course of their marriage. The balances were noted. The dates of establishment were noted. Then the third page. It was a printout of an email, Sarah's words, written 8 years ago, addressed to me. I had kept it because I keep everything. She had written, "Dad, please don't tell Marcus what I earn. He'll feel diminished by it, and I don't want that to be the thing between us. I just want him to respect me for what I do, not what I make. Is that naive? Maybe, but I'm not ready to have that conversation yet." I had read that email many times over 8 years. I knew it by memory. Marcus read it standing in the middle of the room, with Robert Chen 2 feet to his left and the city spread out behind the glass behind him. His face had gone from its ordinary color to something closer to red. Not anger exactly, not yet, but the particular flush of a man who has just realized that the room he thought he was standing in has different dimensions than he believed. He looked up at me. I said, "You told that gentleman that Sarah would never be truly successful financially, that she lacks the business instincts." I kept my voice level. This was not difficult. I had been keeping my voice level for a long time. "Sarah earns 5 times your annual income. She manages a budget larger than most small companies. She has done this quietly, without asking you to notice, for 8 years. I paused. "You are not managing the household finances, Marcus. You are managing your own assumptions. Those are not the same thing." He said nothing. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. Robert Chen was looking at the floor. He was a man who understood numbers, and he had just watched a man who did not understand them discover that fact in public. I took the envelope back from Marcus's hand gently, the way you take something fragile from someone who is no longer holding it properly, and I put it back in my jacket pocket. "Enjoy the evening," I said. Then I turned and walked back toward the windows. I picked up my water glass from the ledge where I had left it. The bay was still dark and flat and very still, the same as it had been from my kitchen window the night before, the same as it had been from this city's edge for as long as I had lived here. I did not look back at Marcus. I had other things to look at. I heard it anyway. I was near the windows, my back to the room, when I heard a woman's voice clear, unhurried, the voice of someone who has no reason to lower it. "Marcus." I recognized the name from Sarah's team rosters. Karen Lim, VP of Engineering. She had been standing 3 feet away the entire time, a glass of water in one hand, and I had clocked her when I first entered the room, the kind of person who listens before she speaks, and listens carefully. Sarah built this division from 12 people to 60, she said. "I've watched her do it, every quarter, every product cycle, every client escalation she absorbed so the rest of us could keep moving." A pause. "I just thought you should know that." I did not hear Marcus respond. I don't think he did. The letter arrived at Marcus's office on a Tuesday morning, 2 days after the party. Patricia had sent it by certified mail return receipt, requested addressed to Marcus James Morrison, with the firm's full letterhead centered at the top of the page. I know this because Patricia called me the moment the tracking system confirmed delivery. "He signed for it himself," she said, 9:47 this morning. I was at my desk in the office on 3rd Avenue, reviewing a client's portfolio, rebalancing. I set the file to one side and wrote the time in the margin of my notepad, 9:47. I have always written times down. It is a habit from my years in auditing, when the sequence of events mattered as much as the events themselves. The letter was 3 pages. Patricia had written it carefully, not aggressively, not with the theatrical flourish some attorneys use when they want to intimidate. It was precise and formal and entirely unemotional, which is exactly why it was devastating. The opening paragraph stated that her firm had been retained by Sarah Chen Morrison to conduct an independent verification of separate property assets held in her name prior to and during the marriage. The second paragraph cited the relevant provisions of Washington State Community Property Law, the sections that distinguish between assets accumulated jointly and those held separately, maintained separately, and documented as such from the point of acquisition. The third paragraph contained the list. 5 accounts, each one named and numbered, each one with a balance current as of the previous Friday. The total stated plainly at the bottom of the list without emphasis or italics, $2,841,000. Below that, one final sentence. These assets constitute separate property under RCW 26.16.010 and are not subject to division as community property. Marcus called Sarah at 11:15. I know the time because Sarah called me at 11:22 and told me exactly what he had said, word for word, in the flat voice she uses when she is controlling something carefully. He had said, "I just got a letter from a lawyer. What are you doing?" She had said, "I'm protecting my finances. Dad helped me realize that silence isn't a strategy. It's a mistake." There was a pause of several seconds. She told me. Then Marcus said, "You went to your father about this." She said, "I went to my father about a lot of things. That's what fathers are for." She hung up before he could answer. I heard the composure in her voice when she told me not triumph, not satisfaction, just the particular steadiness of a person who has finally said the thing they should have said a long time ago. I held the phone for a moment after she finished. The view from my window was the same as always: the water, the gray November sky, a ferry moving slowly toward the terminal. I told her I was proud of her. She said she knew. Marcus came to my office on Thursday afternoon, unannounced. My assistant, a young woman named Carrie who has worked with me for 6 years, called back to tell me a man was asking to see me and would not give a reason. I told her to send him in. He looked different from the man I had watched at the party 2 nights earlier. The jacket was the same quality, but he had not pressed it. His hair was not quite right. He sat down across from me without being invited and put both hands flat on the desk between us, the way people do when they want to appear in control and are not. "You had no right," he said. "Whatever you told Sarah, whatever you helped her do, that was our marriage, our finances. You had no right to get involved." I let him finish. I have learned, over many decades, that silence makes people say things they would not otherwise say. He said 2 more sentences before I spoke. Both were useful. "I didn't get involved in your marriage," I said. "I helped my daughter understand what she already owned. Those are different things. She hid money from me. She held separate accounts she was legally entitled to hold. The law in this state is very clear on that distinction. If you'd like, I can show you the relevant statutes." He looked at me the way people look when they realize the conversation is not going to go the direction they planned. "She made me look like an idiot," he said, "in front of everyone at that party." I picked up my pen and set it back down. "Marcus," I said, "at that party, you told a room full of people, including your wife's colleagues and her family, that she would never make it on her own, that she had no head for money, that she depended on you." I paused. "I didn't make you say any of that." He didn't answer. "You had 6 years," I said. 6 years to ask her what she earned. 6 years to sit down together and look at the numbers. She would have shown you. That's the kind of person she is." I looked at him steadily. "You never asked." He left without saying anything further. Carrie watched him go from her desk in the outer office. She told me afterward that he stood at the elevator for almost a full minute before it arrived, not looking at his phone, not moving, just standing. She came in after the elevator closed. She set a file on my desk and said, quietly, "He didn't know. Did he?" It wasn't a question. "No," I said, "he didn't." She nodded once and went back to her desk without saying anything further. Carrie has worked with me for 6 years. She is not a person who says things she doesn't mean. I went back to my client's portfolio file. The numbers were the same as they had been before he came in. The call to James Hartley happened the same afternoon. James told me about it himself. When he called me that evening, he has known our family for 4 years, since Sarah's division expanded, and he joined the company's leadership team, and he called because he thought I should know. Marcus had contacted the HR department directly, asking to speak with someone about employee compensation verification. James had taken the call himself when he saw whose name was on the inquiry. He wanted me to confirm her salary. James told me. There was something careful in his voice, not quite amusement, not quite disapproval. He said he had reason to believe there had been a discrepancy in what he'd been told. "What did you tell him?" I told him the truth. Sarah's total compensation package for the current fiscal year is $760,000, salary, performance bonus, and equity distribution. James paused. I also told him that this information is documented in our HR system and has been consistent for the past 3 years, with an upward trajectory before that. How did he respond? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he hadn't known. James's voice shifted slightly. I told him I didn't understand how that was possible. She's been a director-level employee since before they were married. Her title is on her email signature. Her compensation is commensurate with her role. Another pause. I also told him that a man who speaks publicly about his wife's inability to succeed financially when his wife earns 3 times what he does might want to spend some time thinking about why he never thought to ask. I wrote the figure in my notepad again, though I already knew it. $760,000. I had watched Sarah build toward that number for 8 years, the late nights, the product launches, the weeks when she worked through weekends and called me on Sunday evenings not to complain, but to think out loud about a problem she was trying to solve. She never told me to be proud of her. She just worked, the way her mother had worked, the way I had tried to work, as if the work itself was the point, and the reward was incidental. Marcus had been in the same house with her for 6 years and had never once looked at the number. Patricia called me Friday morning. She had a particular tone when she called about matters that had resolved themselves in the direction she expected, not gloating, because Patricia does not gloat. but a certain precision in her voice, as if the conversation were a document she was reading aloud. He contacted me yesterday, she said, through his own attorney, a man named Bryce Callahan who works out of a firm in Bellevue. Callahan sent a letter asking whether there were grounds to reclassify any of the listed accounts as community property given the length of the marriage. And I sent him 14 pages. I could hear the faint sound of her setting something down on her desk. The documentation on those accounts goes back to before the wedding, the trust established by Sarah's uncle, the patent licensing income, the investment accounts she opened in her own name before she ever met Marcus, and maintained in her own name throughout. Every deposit, every statement, every tax filing. She paused. Callahan called me this morning. He said he was advising his client that the reclassification argument had no merit. What did Marcus say to that? According to Callahan, he said, and I'm quoting, "How did I not know any of this?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. I told Callahan to tell his client that was exactly the right question, and that he should sit with it for a while. Another pause, shorter. David, he genuinely had no idea. Not about the accounts, not about the salary, not about the trust. He built an entire picture of their financial life together and never once checked whether it corresponded to reality. I know, I said. He told Callahan that he felt deceived. I looked out the window. A container ship was moving slowly through the Sound, its hull dark against the gray water. She never lied to him, I said. She held things separately because she had reason to, but she never lied. No, Patricia said. She didn't. She just stopped volunteering information to someone who had already decided he knew the answer. She paused once more, and when she spoke again, her voice was measured and final, the way it gets when she is closing a document. He couldn't deny it anymore. David, the accounts exist, the salary exists, the records exist. A man can tell himself a story for a long time, but he cannot tell it to a judge. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a while without doing anything. The portfolio file was still open in front of me. James Hartley called me the following Monday. He had a particular way of opening conversations that contained information he thought I needed a brief pause before he said my name, as if he were confirming I was ready. He said, "David, something you should know." He told me that Marcus had sent an email to his own managing broker the morning after Patricia's letter arrived, an attempt, apparently meant to explain the situation before it explained itself. He had written that there had been a misunderstanding about his household finances, that certain accounts had been maintained without his knowledge, and that he was pursuing legal clarification. He had used the phrase, working through a disclosure issue 3 times. The email had been forwarded, not widely, James was careful about that word, widely, but it had reached at least 2 people in the commercial real estate community in Bellevue. One of them was a man named Gerald Foss, a senior partner at a development firm that had been in late-stage discussions with Marcus about a commercial property listing on the east side. Gerald Foss, James told me, was a longtime personal friend of Robert Chen. He pulled the listing, James said, called Marcus's broker directly, said he preferred to work with someone whose professional judgment he could rely on without reservation. A pause. That's a $2.4 million listing. David, gone. I wrote the number in my notepad. Below it, I wrote Gerald Foss's name, and below that, I wrote Robert Chen. The connections in this city are not complicated if you have been here long enough to trace them. Marcus sent the email himself, I said. He did, James said. Nobody had to do anything. He just explained himself, and the explanation was enough. I thanked James and hung up. I looked at the notepad for a moment, then I closed it. The numbers on the page were someone else's, a retired teacher in Redmond who had saved carefully for 30 years and wanted to know if she had enough. She did. I had told her so on Wednesday, and she had cried a little, the quiet kind of crying that is really just relief. I thought about Marcus standing at that elevator. I had spent 6 years watching him move through the rooms of my daughter's life with the confidence of a man who believed he understood the terrain. He had understood nothing. Not her work, not her income, not the quiet architecture of financial independence she had built before he ever arrived. He had looked at her and seen what he expected to see, and he had never looked again. I thought about something Sarah had said to me months earlier on an evening when she had come to dinner alone and we had sat at the kitchen table after the dishes were cleared. She had said, "Dad, I think I made myself smaller than I am." Not for him. Exactly. Just I got used to not saying things. And then the not saying became the habit, and I forgot it was a choice. I had not answered right away. I'd looked at the table between us, the same table where she had done homework as a child, where her mother had spread out fabric samples when she was redecorating, where I had signed papers I did not always understand the full weight of until later. "It's still a choice," I had said finally. It just became an unconscious one. The good news about unconscious choices is that you can make them conscious again. She had nodded slowly. She had looked, in that moment, very much like her mother, not in her features, which are her own, but in the particular quality of her stillness when she is deciding something. I picked up the pen and closed the portfolio file. Outside, the container ship had moved past the window frame and was gone. The water was the same flat gray it had been all morning. Patricia had said he felt deceived. I understood that feeling. In the abstract, the vertigo of discovering that the map you have been using does not match the territory. But there is a difference between being deceived and being incurious. Marcus had never asked. He had assumed, and his assumption had been comfortable. And comfort has a way of making questions feel unnecessary until they become impossible to avoid. He had no idea. He had stood in that room 2 nights ago and told people his wife would never make it, and he had believed it completely. And he had been wrong by $2,841,000 in a salary that would have told him everything if he had ever once thought to ask. I wrote one more line in my notepad, below the time and the figure. He couldn't deny it anymore. Then I capped the pen, put the notepad in my desk drawer, and went to the window. The ferry was coming back across the Sound, moving steadily through the gray water toward the terminal. I watched it for a moment. Then I went back to work. Sarah called me the morning after Patricia's presentation. Not to talk about Marcus, not to talk about the numbers, not to talk about any of it. She called to ask if I wanted to have breakfast at the place on Eastlake we used to go to when she was in graduate school, the one with the wide windows and the mediocre eggs and the very good coffee. I said yes. I was already awake. She was there before me, which she almost never was. She had a cup in front of her and her laptop open, but the screen was dark. She closed it when I sat down. That meant something. With Sarah. She didn't close her laptop for people she wasn't fully present with. We ordered. The eggs came. We talked about the ferry schedule, about a documentary she'd been watching, about whether the Pike Place Market would survive another round of construction on the waterfront. We talked about everything except the thing we were both thinking about. That was fine. I had learned a long time ago that Sarah arrived at hard conversations on her own timetable, not mine. She was halfway through her coffee when she said, "Dad, do you think I should file?" I looked at her. She was watching the window. The water was visible from where we were sitting, flat and gray under the November overcast. She looked tired, not broken, not defeated, just tired the way a person looks when they've been carrying something alone for a long time and have only recently put it down. "I don't know," I said. "Do you want to?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know either," she said. "I keep thinking I should feel more certain than I do. After everything." She turned her cup in her hands. "But I'm not scared anymore. That's different from before. Before, I was silent because I was scared. Now I'm just thinking. There's a difference." There was. I knew the difference. Her mother had known it too. "You'll figure it out," I said. She nodded, and we finished breakfast. And I paid. And she let me. Which she also almost never did. Doh. The change in Marcus was visible within a week. I didn't witness most of it directly. Sarah mentioned things in passing, the way she mentioned most things, without emphasis, as if they were simply facts to be recorded. He had apologized. He had asked to talk. He had bought flowers. which she had put in a vase on the kitchen counter because she didn't believe in wasting flowers regardless of who had sent them. What she told me, and what I believed, was that he kept trying to steer the conversations to make them about his feelings, his surprise, his sense of having been misled. She said he used the word blindsided 3 times in one evening. She said she had listened, and then she had said, very quietly, "Marcus, I never lied to you. You never asked." He didn't have an answer for that. He tried to find one, apparently, but there wasn't one available. She told me this on the phone one evening, her voice entirely level, and I thought, she's not angry. She's past anger. She's somewhere on the other side of it, in a place that's much harder to argue with. He called Patricia the following week. Patricia called me the day after. He wanted to know about financial deception, she said, whether Sarah's failure to disclose her income constituted grounds for a claim. I could hear her pouring something in the background tea. Probably. Patricia was a tea person. I explained the law to him. Carefully. There's no legal obligation to volunteer financial information to a spouse who never asks. Sarah didn't hide accounts. She opened them before the marriage. She maintained them in her name. She paid her taxes. She disclosed everything required by law. A pause. He asked me if I was sure. I told him I'd been sure for 31 years. What did he say? He said he needed to think. Another pause. David, he's going to lose significantly if she files. The prenuptial agreement is sound. Her separate property is documented, and his income is well. You know what his income is. I did. I had looked it up, the way I looked most things up, quietly and without announcing that I had done so. He's not in a position to negotiate from strength, Patricia said. No, I said, he's not. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she's going to be fine. You know, whatever she decides. I know, I said. I've known that for a while. Sarah didn't file. Not immediately. She called me in December and told me she and Marcus were starting sessions with a therapist, someone she had chosen, at an office in Capitol Hill. A woman with a long waiting list and a reputation for not letting people avoid the thing they'd come to avoid. I didn't tell her what I thought about that. It wasn't my decision, and I had learned slowly, over many years, through many mistakes, that the most important thing I could do for Sarah was not to make her decisions for her. I could protect the structure around her. I could make sure the documents were right, and the accounts were sound, and the legal ground was solid. The rest was hers. What she told me after the 3rd session was this: she had said out loud in that office with Marcus sitting across from her, that she earned what she earned, that she had built what she had built, and that she expected to be treated as someone who had done those things, not celebrated, not managed, treated as an equal by someone who understood what equal actually meant. Marcus, she said, had not responded immediately. He had looked at the floor for a long time. Then he had said, "I didn't know." And Sarah had said, "I know you didn't, but you also never asked." Whether that was enough, whether the distance between those two facts could ever be fully crossed, I didn't know. That was between the two of them and whoever helped them try. But something had shifted. I could hear it in her voice. The silence that used to sit in her like a held breath had become something different, not louder, just chosen. She was quiet when she wanted to be quiet. She spoke when she had something to say. The difference was that now she was the one deciding which was which. It was a Tuesday in late January when I sat with my coffee and thought about all of it. The apartment was quiet. The sound was dark and still through the window. The ferry terminal lights reflected in the water below. I had a legal pad in front of me, habit from 40 years of working with numbers, and I hadn't written anything on it. I thought about the night of the dinner. I thought about Marcus standing at the front of that room, confident and loud, telling people that his wife would never make it. I thought about the way he'd said it, not cruelly, exactly, but with the casual certainty of a man who had never once considered that he might be wrong. I thought about the fact that he had lived with Sarah for 6 years and had never asked a single direct question about what she earned or what she had built, or what she was capable of. Not one question. It wasn't malice. It was something harder to name than malice. It was the assumption that he already knew the answer, and that the answer was smaller than him. I thought about Sarah at that breakfast table, turning her coffee cup in her hands, saying, "I'm not scared anymore." I thought about how long it had taken her to get there, and how little of that journey I had actually been able to control. I had helped with the documents. I had kept the records. I had made sure Patricia was in the room. But the thing that had actually changed, the thing that mattered more than any of it, was that Sarah had walked into an office in Capitol Hill and said out loud what she had spent 6 years keeping to herself. Not because I had told her to, not because the money required it, because she had decided it was time. The coffee was warm. I drank it slowly. I thought about what Marcus had said she'll never make it financially, and I thought about the number Patricia had put on the screen 2 months ago, and I thought about the face Marcus had made when he saw it. But what stayed with me wasn't the number. What stayed with me was the moment after, when Sarah had not looked at Marcus at all. She had looked at her phone, checked something, and put it back in her bag, as if the revelation of her own life was simply one more item on a list she had already reviewed. She had known what she was worth the entire time. She had simply been waiting for the moment when it would matter to say it. I closed the legal pad. I didn't write anything on it. There was nothing left to document. Outside, the first ferry of the morning was beginning its crossing, moving steadily through the dark water, its lights steady and unhurried. I watched it until it reached the terminal. Then I rinsed my cup, put on my coat, and went to work. If you've ever watched someone you love carry a truth quietly for years, without complaint, without asking anyone to notice, you already understand why the moment she finally said it out loud was the only ending this story could have had. I'll keep telling stories like this one if they find something true in you.